I haven't slept well in decades. My wife, Elaine, has grown accustomed to my restless nights, the way I pace the house in the early hours, the ritual of checking the locks 3 times before bed, the way I flinch at certain sounds, the sharp click of dress shoes on hardwood, the slow, deliberate creak of a door opening. She no longer asks about the nightmares that leave me drenched in sweat, gasping for air in the darkness before dawn. She's learned when to let things lie. But some things shouldn't stay buried. I'm 64 now. The doctors say my heart isn't what it used to be. I've already survived one minor attack, and the medication they've given me makes my hands tremble like I've got Parkinson's. If I'm going to tell this story, it has to be now, before age, death, or the bottles of whiskey I still rely on to keep the worst memories at bay steal what's left of my mind. This is about Blackwood Reform School for Boys and what happened there during the 6 months I spent in its clutches in 1974. Not the sanitized version the newspapers printed or the lies buried in official records. This is the truth. Someone needs to know before I'm gone. Maybe then, I'll finally find peace. My name is Thaddeus Mitchell. I grew up in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood in Connecticut where manicured lawns hid the cracks in every family's facade. My father worked for an insurance company, wore the same gray suit every day, and came home at 5:30 sharp. My mother taught piano to neighborhood kids, served on the PTA, and made pot roast every Sunday. They were good people, trying their best to raise a son who wouldn't embarrass them in the wake of the cultural chaos of the 60s. I failed them spectacularly. It started small, stealing candy bars from the corner store, skipping school to smoke cigarettes and drink beer with older kids behind the bowling alley. Then came the spray-painted obscenities on Mr. Abernathy's garage door. He'd reported me for stealing his newspaper, followed by the punch I threw at Principal Danning when he caught me smoking in the bathroom. By 13, I developed what the court called a pattern of escalating delinquent behavior. The judge who sentenced me, Judge Harmon, with his steel gray hair and eyes like shards of ice, was a firm believer in the scared straight approach. He gave my parents a choice: 6 months at Blackwood Reform School or juvenile detention followed by probation until I turned 18. They chose Blackwood. The brochure made it look like a prestigious boarding school with its grand Victorian architecture and promises of rehabilitation through structure, discipline, and vocational training. My father said it would make a man of me. If only he knew what kind of men Blackwood made. The day my parents drove me there is seared into my memory. The long, winding driveway cutting through acres of dense pine forest. The main building rising ahead, all red brick and sharp angles against the gray autumn sky. The 10-foot fence topped with razor wire that seemed at odds with the school's dignified facade. My mother cried when we parked, asked if I wanted her to come inside. I was too angry to say yes, even though every instinct screamed not to let her leave. My father shook my hand stiffly and told me to make the most of this opportunity. I watched their Buick disappear down the driveway, swallowed by the trees. It was the last time I'd see them for 6 months. Sometimes I wonder if I ever truly saw them before that, or if they ever truly saw me. Headmaster Thorne met me at the entrance, a tall, gaunt man with deep-set eyes and skin so pale it seemed almost translucent. His handshake was cold and dry, like touching parchment. He spoke with an accent I couldn't place, something European but deliberately vague, as if designed to obscure his origins. "Welcome to Blackwood, young man," he said, his dark eyes never quite meeting mine. "We have a long and distinguished history of reforming boys like you. Some of our most successful graduates arrived in much the same state, angry, defiant, lost. They left as pillars of their communities." He didn't elaborate on what kind of communities those were. The intake process was clinical and humiliating: strip search, delousing shower, institutional clothing, gray slacks, white button-up shirts, black shoes that pinched my toes. They took my watch, my wallet, even the Swiss Army knife my grandfather had given me, saying I'd get them back when I left. I never saw any of it again. My assigned room was on the 3rd floor of the East Wing, a narrow cell with 2 iron-framed beds, shared dresser, and a small window overlooking the exercise yard. My roommate was Marcus Reed, a lanky kid from Boston with quick eyes and a crooked smile that never quite reached them. He'd been at Blackwood for 4 months, sent there for joyriding in his uncle's Cadillac. "You'll get used to it," he told me that first night. his voice low even though we were alone. Just keep your head down, don't ask questions, and never, ever be alone with Dr. Faust. I asked who Dr. Faust was. The school physician, Marcus said, glancing at the door as if expecting someone to be listening. He likes to experiment. Says it's for research on adolescent development or some. Just try to stay healthy. The daily routine was rigid and monotonous. Wake at 5:30 a.m., make beds to military precision, hygiene and dress inspection at 6 o'clock, breakfast at 6:30. Classes from 7:30 to noon covering the basics, but with an emphasis on moral education and industrial skills. Lunch, followed by 4 hours of work assignments, kitchen duty, groundskeeping, laundry, maintenance. Dinner at 6 o'clock, mandatory study hall from 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock, lights out at 9:30. There were about 40 boys at Blackwood when I arrived, ranging in age from 12 to 17. Some were hardened troublemakers, violence in their eyes, prison tattoos already on their knuckles despite their youth. Others were like me, ordinary kids who'd made increasingly bad choices. A few seemed out of place entirely, too timid and well-behaved for a reform school. I later learned these were the private placements, boys whose wealthy parents had paid Headmaster Thorne directly to take their embarrassing problems off their hands. Homosexuality, drug use, political radicalism, things that good families couldn't tolerate in the early 70s. The staff consisted of Headmaster Thorne, 6 teachers, all men, all with the same hollow-eyed stare, 4 guards called supervisors, a cook, a groundskeeper, and Dr. Faust. The doctor was a small man with wire-rimmed glasses and meticulously groomed salt and pepper hair. His hands were always clean, nails perfectly trimmed. He spoke with the same unplaceable accent as Thorne. The first sign that something was wrong came 3 weeks after my arrival. Clayton Wheeler, a quiet 15-year-old who kept to himself, was found dead at the bottom of the main staircase, his neck broken. The official explanation was that he'd fallen while sneaking downstairs after lights out. But I'd seen Clayton the evening before, hunched over a notebook in the library, writing frantically. When I approached him to ask about a history assignment, he'd slammed the notebook shut and hurried away, looking over his shoulder as if expecting pursuit. I mentioned this to one of the supervisors, a younger man named Aldrich who seemed more human than the others. He thanked me and promised to look into it. The notebook was never found. Aldrich disappeared 2 weeks later. The official story was that he'd quit suddenly and moved west for a better opportunity. But Emmett Dawson, who worked in the administrative office, saw Aldrich's belongings in a box in Thorne's office, family photos, clothes, even his wallet and keys. No one leaves without their wallet. Emmett disappeared 3 days after telling me about the box. Then Marcus went missing. My roommate, who'd been counting down the days until his release, excited about the welcome home party his mother was planning. The night before he vanished, he shook me awake around midnight, his face pale in the moonlight. "Thad," he whispered, "I need to tell you something. Last night, I saw them taking someone down to the basement. Wheeler wasn't an accident. They're doing something to us, man. I don't know what, but..." The sound of footsteps in the hallway cut him off, the unmistakable click-clack of dressed shoes on hardwood. Marcus dove back into his bed, pulling the covers up. The footsteps stopped outside our door, lingered, then moved on. When I woke the next morning, Marcus was gone. His bed was stripped as if he'd never been there. When I asked where he was, I was told he'd been released early for good behavior. But his clothes were still in our dresser. His mother's letters, filled with plans for his homecoming, were still tucked under his mattress. No one seemed concerned. No police came to investigate. When I tried to talk to other boys about it, they turned away, their eyes filled with fear. After Marcus, they moved in Silas Hargrove, a pale, freckled boy with a stutter who barely spoke above a whisper. He'd been caught breaking into summer homes along Lake Champlain, though he didn't seem the type. He told me his father had lost his job and they'd been living in their car. The break-ins were for food and warmth, not to steal. IJ just wanted us somewhere to sleep, he said one night. Somewhere warm. Blackwood was warm, but it wasn't safe. Silas disappeared within a week. By then, I'd started noticing other things, the way certain areas of the building were always locked, despite being labeled as classrooms or storage on the floor plans. The way some staff members appeared in school photographs dating back decades, unchanged. The sounds at night, furniture being moved in the basement, muffled voices in languages I didn't recognize, screams quickly silenced. The smell that sometimes wafted through the heating vents, metallic and sickly sweet, like blood and decay. I began keeping a journal, hiding it in a loose floorboard beneath my bed. I documented everything, names, dates, inconsistencies in the staff stories. I drew maps of the building, marking restricted areas and times when they were left unguarded. I wasn't sure what I was collecting evidence of, only that something was deeply wrong at Blackwood, and someone needed to know. My new roommate after Silas was Wyatt Blackburn, a heavy-set boy with dead eyes who'd been transferred from a juvenile detention center in Pennsylvania. Unlike the others, Wyatt was genuinely disturbing. He collected dead insects, arranging them in patterns on his windowsill. He watched me while I slept. He had long whispered conversations with himself when he thought I wasn't listening. They're choosing, he told me once out of nowhere. Separating the wheat from the chaff. Your wheat, Mitchell. Special. They've been watching you. I asked who they were. He just smiled, showing teeth that seemed too small, too numerous. The old ones. The ones who've always been here. Then he laughed, a sound like glass breaking. Don't worry. It's an honor to be chosen. I became more cautious after that, watching the patterns, looking for a way out. The fence was too high, topped with razor wire. The forest beyond was miles of wilderness. The only phone was in Thorne's office, and mail was read before being sent out. But I kept planning, kept watching. The basement became the focus of my attention. Whatever was happening at Blackwood, the basement was central to it. Staff would escort selected boys down there for specialized therapy sessions. Those boys would return quiet, compliant, their eyes vacant. Some didn't return at all. December brought heavy snow, blanketing the grounds and making the old building creak and groan as temperatures plummeted. The heating system struggled, leaving our rooms cold enough to see our breath. Extra blankets were distributed, scratchy wool things that smelled of mothballs and something else. Something that made me think of hospital disinfectant. It was during this cold snap that I made my discovery. My work assignment that month was maintenance, which meant I spent hours with Mr. Weiss, the ancient groundskeeper, fixing leaky pipes and replacing blown fuses. Weiss rarely spoke, but when he did, it was with that same unplaceable accent as Thorne and Faust. We were repairing a burst pipe in one of the first floor bathrooms when Weiss was called away to deal with an issue in the boiler room. He told me to wait, but as soon as he was gone, I began exploring. The bathroom was adjacent to one of the locked areas, and I'd noticed a ventilation grate near the floor that might connect them. The grate came away easily, the screws loose with age. Behind it was a narrow duct, just large enough for a skinny 13-year-old to squeeze through. I didn't hesitate. This might be my only chance to see what they were hiding. The duct led to another grate, this one overlooking what appeared to be a laboratory. Glass cabinets lined the walls, filled with specimens floating in cloudy fluid, organs, tissue samples, things I couldn't identify. Metal tables gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights. One held what looked like medical equipment, scalpels, forceps, things with blades and teeth whose purpose I could only guess at. Another held a body. I couldn't see the face from my angle, just the bare feet, one with a small butterfly tattoo on the ankle. I recognized that tattoo. Emmett Dawson had gotten it in honor of his little sister who died of leukemia. The door to the laboratory opened, and Dr. Faust entered, followed by Headmaster Thorne and another man I didn't recognize, tall, blonde, with the same hollow eyes as the rest of the staff. They were speaking that language again, the one I couldn't identify. Faust gestured to the body, pointing out something I couldn't see. The blonde man nodded, made a note on a clipboard. Thorne said something that made the others laugh, a sound like ice cracking. Then they were moving toward the body, Faust reaching for one of the gleaming instruments. I backed away from the grate so quickly I nearly gave myself away, banging my elbow against the metal duct. I froze, heart pounding, certain they'd heard. But no alarm was raised. I squirmed backward until I reached the bathroom, replaced the grate with shaking hands, and was sitting innocently on the supply bucket when Weiss returned. That night, I lay awake long after lights out, listening to Wyatt's wet, snuffling breaths from the next bed. I knew I had to escape, not just for my sake, but to tell someone what was happening. The problem was evidence. No one would believe a delinquent teenager without proof. The next day, I stole a camera from the photography club. It was an old Kodak, nothing fancy, but it had half a roll of film left. I needed to get back to that laboratory to document what I'd seen. I also needed my journal, names, dates, everything I'd recorded. Together, they might be enough to convince someone to investigate. Opportunity came during the Christmas break. Most of the boys went home for the holidays, but about a dozen of us had nowhere to go. Parents who didn't want us, or in my case, parents who had been told it was therapeutically inadvisable to interrupt my rehabilitation process. The reduced population meant fewer staff on duty, less supervision. The night of December 23rd, I waited until the midnight bed check was complete. Wyatt was gone. He'd been taken for one of those therapy sessions that afternoon and hadn't returned. I had the room to myself. I retrieved my journal from its hiding place, tucked the camera into my waistband, and slipped into the dark hallway. The building was quiet except for the omnipresent creaking of old wood and the hiss of the radiators. I made my way down the service stairs at the far end of the east wing, avoiding the main staircase where a night supervisor was usually stationed. My plan was to enter the laboratory through the same ventilation duct, take my photographs, and be back in bed before the 3 a.m. bed check. I never made it that far. As I reached the first floor landing, I heard voices, Thorne and Faust, speaking English this time, their words echoing up the stairwell from below. The latest batch is promising, Faust was saying. Particularly the Mitchell boy. His resistance to the initial treatments is most unusual. You're certain? Thorne's voice, skeptical. The blood work confirms it. He has the markers we've been looking for. With the proper conditioning, he could be most useful. And the others? A dismissive sound from Faust. Failed subjects. We'll process them tomorrow. The Hargrove boy yielded some interesting tissue samples, but nothing remarkable. The Reed boy's brain showed potential, but degraded too quickly after extraction. I must have made a sound, a gasp, a sob, something, because the conversation stopped abruptly. Then came the sound of dress shoes on the stairs below me, coming up. Click, clack. Click, clack. I ran. Not back to my room, they'd look there first, but toward the administrative offices. Emmett had once mentioned that one of the windows in the file room had a broken lock. If I could get out that way, make it to the fence where the snow had drifted high enough to reach the top, maybe I had a chance. I was halfway down the hall when I heard it, a high, keening sound, like a hunting horn, but wrong somehow, discordant. It echoed through the building, and in its wake came other sounds, doors opening, footsteps from multiple directions, voices calling in that strange language. The hunt was on. I reached the file room, fumbled in the dark for the window. The lock was indeed broken, but the window was painted shut. I could hear them getting closer, the click-clack of dress shoes, the heavier tread of the supervisor's boots. I grabbed a metal paperweight from the desk and smashed it against the window. The glass shattered outward, cold air rushing in. As I was climbing through, something caught my ankle, a hand, impossibly cold, its grip like iron. I kicked back wildly, connected with something solid. The grip loosened just enough for me to pull free, tumbling into the snow outside. The ground,